Grandma confesses, "My daughter said old people should just watch TV and uninvited me from a trip." The unexpected comment from her daughter shakes their relationship. Feeling rejected, the grandmother decides to take a radical action. What happens next reveals family secrets and challenges the boundaries of respect. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The coffee was getting cold on the kitchen table as Frank observed the empty chair across from him. 42 years of marriage had ended 3 months ago, but he still prepared 2 cups every morning. The habit was stronger than reason, as if the routine could bring Margaret back, even if just for a few seconds of illusion. The 3-bedroom house in the Brighton Heights neighborhood seemed to have doubled in size since she left. Each room echoed his lonely footsteps. Each piece of furniture held a memory that now weighed like lead in his chest. Frank sighed and brought the cup to his lips. The bitter coffee matched the taste life had acquired lately. At 71, he saw himself as a castaway amid the wreckage of an existence that once made sense. Margaret was his compass, his confidant, the only person who understood his anxieties without needing explanations. With her, he shared the weight of difficult decisions, the fears he couldn't show others, the dreams he still nurtured even in his golden years. The phone ring broke the morning silence. Frank looked at the device on the kitchen counter, hesitating. He knew it was Ashley, his daughter. Her calls followed a predictable pattern, always short, always with some request disguised as filial concern. "Hello, Dad?" Her voice sounded rushed, as always. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine, Ashley. And you?" "Oh, you know how it is, chasing after bills. Brian is having some problems at work, and things are a bit tight at our house." A calculated pause. "Dad, could you help me with the rent this month? It's just a little temporary help." Frank closed his eyes. It was always like this. Since Margaret had passed, Ashley's calls had been reduced to requests for money. There were no more long Sunday phone calls where she would talk about her daily life, genuinely ask about his health, share moments from her children's lives. "I'll transfer the money this afternoon," he said, his voice tired. "Thanks, Dad. You're an angel. I need to hang up now. I'm late for work. Kiss." The line went dead before he could even say goodbye. Frank put the phone back on the hook and sat back down at the table. Margaret's chair seemed even emptier now. He remembered when Ashley was little, how she would run into his arms when he came home from work. Back then, he worked as an accountant at a construction company, left early and returned late, but always reserved special time for his daughter. He would take her to the park on Sundays, help with homework, patiently listen to her school stories. When Ashley married Brian, Frank felt a mixture of joy and apprehension. His son-in-law seemed like a good guy at first, attentive and respectful. But Frank, with years of experience, soon noticed something calculating in Brian's gestures. The way he always found a subtle way to mention his financial difficulties, how he excessively praised his father-in-law's generosity, how his eyes sparkled when the subject was inheritance. Margaret tried to reassure him. "You're being paranoid. Frank, Brian is a good husband to our daughter." But even she, in recent years, had begun to notice changes in the couple's behavior. Visits became rarer and always coincided with some financial need. The grandchildren, Dylan and Emma, 8 and 10 years old, only came to see him when Ashley needed something. And when they came, they seemed uncomfortable, as if they had been instructed to be especially affectionate with their grandfather. Frank got up and walked to the living room. On the shelf, a family photo watched him. Himself, Margaret, Ashley, Brian and the grandchildren, taken during their last Christmas together. Margaret was already sick, but she had insisted on preparing the traditional Christmas dinner. It was the last time the house filled with voices and laughter. Now, 3 months later, Frank realized it wasn't just Margaret who had departed. It was as if the entire family had said goodbye along with her. Ashley only called when she needed money. Brian had disappeared completely, not even calling to see how his father-in-law was dealing with the loss. The grandchildren seemed to have forgotten they had a grandfather. The weight of loneliness was suffocating. Frank had always been a strong man, someone everyone leaned on. For decades, he was the family's financial and emotional pillar. He worked double to provide education for Ashley, helped the couple buy their first house, paid for medical treatments, graduations, always with a smile on his face and a heart willing to help. But now, when he was the one who needed support, companionship, a word of affection, where was this family for which he had sacrificed so much? The doorbell rang, interrupting his melancholic thoughts. Frank opened the door and was surprised to see Michael, his godson, standing on the threshold with a genuine smile on his face. "Hi, Godfather. I came to see how you're doing." Michael was 35 and the son of Linda, Margaret's best friend. Frank had baptized him when he was a baby and watched him grow up like a second father. Unlike Ashley, Michael had always maintained a sincere and disinterested relationship with his godfather. "Michael, what a nice surprise." Frank felt the first genuine smile of the day form on his lips. Come in, come in. I brought some bread from the bakery you like, and I thought we could have coffee together." As they prepared coffee in the kitchen, Frank observed Michael with affection. The young man worked as a history teacher at a public school, earned little but lived with dignity. He had never asked for borrowed money, never insinuated he needed financial help. When he visited Frank, he was genuinely interested in his company, his stories, in how he was feeling. "How have these days been, Godfather?" Michael asked while cutting the bread. "Difficult," Frank admitted. It was the first time in months that someone had asked this question expecting a truthful answer. "The house is very quiet without her." "I can imagine. Aunt Margaret was a special person. I remember how she took care of all of us when we were children." They talked for more than 2 hours. Michael wasn't in a hurry, didn't look at the clock, didn't give signs that he was there out of obligation. He asked about Frank's health, about his memories with Margaret, about his plans. It was as if he really cared about the answers. When Michael finally said goodbye, promising to return the following week, Frank found himself alone again. But this time the loneliness didn't weigh as much. His godson's visit had brought a relief he hadn't experienced in months, a feeling that there was still someone in the world who cared about him as a person, not as a source of resources. That night, as he prepared for bed, Frank reflected on the difference between Ashley's morning call and Michael's afternoon visit. One had left him feeling empty and used, the other filled with affection and hope. For the first time since Margaret had passed, Frank began to question whether he was really surrounded by a family or just by people who saw him as a walking bank account. The doubt planted in his mind began to grow, like a seed that had found fertile soil in a heart wounded by indifference. The days following Michael's visit brought a subtle but significant change in Frank's perception. As if a fog that had covered his vision for months began to dissipate, he started observing the behavior patterns around him more attentively. On the following Thursday, Ashley showed up at his house without warning. Frank was watering the garden, plants when she parked on the sidewalk. His heart filled with hope. Perhaps she had come just to see him, to ease her longing, to talk about Margaret. "Hi, Dad." Ashley quickly kissed his cheek, but Frank noticed she seemed nervous, looking around as if she were in a hurry. "How are Mom's plants?" "They're beautiful. She always said they knew when they were cared for with love." Frank smiled, remembering Margaret kneeling in that same garden, whispering sweet words to the flowers. "That's true." Ashley seemed uncomfortable with the mention of her mother. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important." They sat on the porch. Frank served orange juice and waited, trying not to feed expectations. Ashley fidgeted with her hands, clearly rehearsing the words she would say. "Brian lost his job last week," she finally said. "The company is cutting employees because of the crisis. We're worried about the future, especially because of the children." Frank nodded, genuinely concerned. "I'm sorry, Ashley. Is Brian already looking for other opportunities?" "He is, of course. But you know how difficult the job market is these days." She paused, took a deep breath. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about a proposal. Brian had an idea." The mention of his son-in-law put Frank on alert. In recent months, all of Brian's ideas somehow involved his father-in-law's money. What kind of proposal? Well, you're here alone in this big house, and we're going through financial difficulties. Brian thought it might be a good idea if we moved here temporarily. That way you'd have company and we could save on rent. Frank felt a tightness in his chest. The house where he had lived for 42 years with Margaret, where every corner held a sacred memory, being invaded by people who only sought him out when they needed something. It's a big change, Ashley. I need to think about it. Of course, Dad. Just don't take too long because our situation is quite complicated. She stood up, clearly relieved to have accomplished her mission. Oh, and Brian wanted to know if you could lend him $5,000 to pay off some bills while he looks for a job. It's just a temporary loan. $5,000. Once again, the conversation ended with a request for money. Frank nodded mechanically, but something inside him began to revolt against this situation. After Ashley left, Frank stayed on the porch for hours, watching the movement on the street. Neighbors returning from work, children playing on the sidewalk, life happening around him, while he felt increasingly disconnected from everything. The following Saturday, while shopping at the supermarket, Frank met Mrs. Thompson, a longtime neighbor. They chatted about trivialities until she, with the typical sincerity of the elderly, said something that made him stop and think. "Frank, I don't want to be nosy, but I've noticed you seem a bit down lately. Besides missing Margaret, of course. Is everything okay with the family?" Frank hesitated. It was the first time someone had made this observation. "Why do you ask, Mrs. Thompson?" "Oh, it's just that I see Ashley passing by here now and then, always in a rush. And yesterday I overheard a phone conversation of hers while I was in the garden." Mrs. Thompson lowered her voice. "She was complaining to someone about you not having decided yet about them moving into your house. She was saying something about, for the old man is getting stubborn, and that they needed to find a way to convince him." The words hit Frank like a punch to the stomach. The old man. That's how his daughter referred to him when she thought no one was listening. Not my dad or daddy, but the stubborn old man who needed to be convinced to do their bidding. That night Frank could barely sleep. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories from the past months. Each call from Ashley, each visit, each request for money took on a new meaning. He began to see a pattern that his paternal kindness had previously prevented him from recognizing. On Monday, Brian showed up at his house. It was the first time his son-in-law had visited him alone since Margaret's passing. Frank received him with curiosity, wondering what had motivated this visit. "Hey Frank, how are you?" Brian entered the living room with a familiarity that bothered his father-in-law. "Ashley said she talked to you about our proposal." "Yes, she mentioned it." "Look, I know it might seem like a drastic change, but think about it. You'd have company. The grandkids would always be around and we could help with house maintenance." Brian spoke in a tone that tried to be convincing, but Frank perceived the falseness behind the words. "And you would save on rent," Frank completed. "Well, yes, that would help us a lot too, but the main thing is you not being alone." Margaret always worried about that, didn't she? She always said she didn't want you to be abandoned. The mention of Margaret deeply irritated him. Brian barely knew his wife, as he rarely visited her when she was alive. Now he was using her name to manipulate him. "Brian, can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "When was the last time you visited me before Margaret passed?" Brian seemed uncomfortable. "Oh, you know how it is, busy life, work. It was on her birthday 2 years ago and you stayed less than an hour." "Frank, And after she was gone, how many times did you call to see how I was doing?" Brian's silence was more eloquent than any answer. Frank continued, feeling a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in months. "You know what I've learned in these months of solitude? I've learned the difference between who cares about me and who cares about what I can offer. It's not like that. Frank, we care about you. You care so much that you only show up when you need money. You care so much that you call me the stubborn old man when you think no one is listening." Brian's face paled. "Who said that?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm finally seeing the truth." Frank stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. "I'll think about your proposal, but don't delude yourselves thinking I'm just a walking bank." After Brian left, Clearly uncomfortable, Frank felt a strange sensation. It was as if he had just woken up from a deep sleep. The pain of losing Margaret was still there, but now it was no longer mixed with the confusion and guilt he felt toward the family. That afternoon, he called Michael. "Godfather, it's good to hear your voice. How are you?" "Michael, could you come over tonight? I'd like to talk to you about some things." "Of course, I'll be there at 7. When Michael arrived, Frank had already prepared dinner. As they ate, he told him about Ashley and Brian's proposal, about the conversation with Mrs. Thompson, about his growing perception of how he was being treated. Michael listened in silence without interrupting. When Frank finished, he sighed. "Godfather, I didn't want to have to say this, but I had already noticed it for some time. My mom commented on it too. The way they treat you, it's not genuine affection." "Why did you never say anything?" "Because it wasn't my place, and because I knew you needed to come to this conclusion on your own." They talked until late at night. Michael helped Frank organize his thoughts to see the situation more clearly. He wasn't trying to influence him against the family, just offering a friendly ear and an external perspective. When Michael said goodbye, Frank felt less alone than he had in months. For the first time since Margaret had passed, he didn't feel like a victim of circumstances, but like someone who had choices to make, and one of those choices was becoming increasingly clear in his mind. The days that followed the conversation with Michael brought a gradual but profound transformation in Frank. It was as if, after months wandering in a fog of grief and confusion, he had finally found a light that illuminated the path ahead. The following Wednesday, he made a decision that had been quietly maturing. He scheduled an appointment with Mr. Richard Morris, the lawyer who had handled the family's legal matters for more than 15 years. The decision wasn't impulsive, but the result of careful reflection about the future he wanted for himself and his assets. Mr. Morris's office was located downtown, in an old building that radiated sobriety and trust. Frank had been there several times over the years, always accompanied by Margaret, dealing with issues related to their will, life insurance, and investments they had built together through decades of hard work. "Frank, my friend, how are you handling everything?" Mr. Morris received him with a warm embrace. He had been not only the family's lawyer, but also a close friend, someone who had known Frank and Margaret's story since the first years of marriage. "I'm finding strength, Richard. Actually, I came here because I need to make some important changes to my documents." Mr. Morris nodded, indicating one of the armchairs in front of his desk. "Of course, what's this about?" Frank took a deep breath before starting. "I want to change my will." The lawyer showed no surprise. Testamentary changes after losing a spouse were more common than many people imagined. "What kind of changes do you have in mind?" "I want to remove Ashley and Brian as my main heirs." The words came out with a firmness that surprised Frank himself. "I want to leave everything to Michael, my godson." Now Mr. Morris did seem genuinely surprised. He had known Ashley since she was a child, had followed her growth, her marriage, the birth of Frank's grandchildren. "Frank, that's a very serious decision. Are you sure that's what you want to do?" "I'm absolutely certain." Frank leaned forward, his eyes shining with a determination he hadn't shown in months. "Richard, you've known me for years. You know I've never been an impulsive or vindictive person, but you also know I've always been someone who values dignity and respect." "Yes, I've always known that." "Then you'll understand when I say I've discovered that my own daughter and son-in-law see me only as a source of resources. They treat me like the stubborn old man who needs to be convinced to do their bidding." Frank spent the next 20 minutes relating the events of recent months. Ashley's self-interested calls, Brian's manipulations, the proposal to move into his house, the words Mrs. Thompson had overheard. Mr. Morris listened in silence, making occasional notes. When Frank finished, the lawyer sighed. "I understand your position, Frank, but I need to warn you about the consequences of this decision. Ashley could challenge the will in court, claiming you weren't of sound mind. That's why I came to you first. I want everything to be done in the most legal and unquestionable way possible, And I want to leave my reasons in writing, so there's no doubt about my mental soundness and my will. Very well. We'll arrange a psychological evaluation to certify your mental capacity, and you'll need to write a letter explaining your motivations in detail. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the legal details. Mr. Morris, despite his initial surprise, soon understood that Frank was making a thoughtful and conscious decision. It wasn't anger or revenge that motivated him, but a deep need to recover his dignity and ensure that his legacy would go to someone who truly valued him. The following Friday, Frank underwent a complete psychological evaluation. The psychologist, Dr. Thomas Wells, certified in writing that the patient was of sound mind, demonstrating clarity of thought, coherence in decisions, and full capacity to manage his assets and make important decisions about his life. Over the weekend, Frank worked on the letter that would explain his motivations. Sitting at the kitchen table where he had so often talked with Margaret, he poured onto paper all the pain, all the disappointment, but also all the hope he felt about the future. I record here, he wrote, that this decision is not born of resentment, but of self-love. I cannot allow my legacy to be wasted by people who see in me only a source of resources. Michael has always shown genuine affection, respect, and values that I consider important. He never asked me for anything, but always offered me what is most valuable, his sincere presence and his disinterested affection. By the following Monday, everything was ready. The new will was registered, the psychological evaluation attached. To the documents, the letter duly notarized. Frank left Mr. Morris's office with a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a long time. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come, telling his family about his decision. That afternoon, he called Ashley. "Hi, Dad. Have you thought about our proposal?" "Yes, Ashley. Actually, I'd like you and Brian to come over tonight. I have something important to talk to you about." "Great. Brian will be very happy. Can we come after dinner?" "Yes, you can." Ashley and Brian arrived at 8 o'clock, clearly excited. Frank received them in the living room, where he had prepared coffee and some cookies that Margaret used to make. "So, Dad, what was your decision?" Ashley asked, before even sitting down completely. Frank observed them for a moment. He saw the expectation in their eyes, the certainty that they would get what they wanted. It was time for the truth. "I decided that you're not going to move in here." Ashley's smile instantly disappeared. "Why, Dad? I thought we had talked about this." "We did talk, and I've reflected a lot on our relationship over the past few months." Frank kept his voice calm but firm. "I realize that you only seek me out when you need something. I realize that I'm treated as the stubborn old man who needs to be convinced to do your bidding." Brian shifted uncomfortably in the armchair. "Frank, I think you're misinterpreting." "I'm not misinterpreting anything. I'm seeing the facts." Frank stood up and walked to the window. "Do you know when the last time you paid me a disinterested visit was? It was on Margaret's birthday, 2 years ago." "Dad, we have our lives, our responsibilities." Ashley tried to defend herself. "Of course you do, but you also have responsibilities toward me who always sacrificed for you." Frank turned to face them. "And since we're talking about responsibilities, I need to communicate another decision I've made." Something in his tone made Ashley and Brian exchange apprehensive looks. "I've changed my will. You are no longer my heirs." The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley turned pale. Brian abruptly stood up from the armchair. "That's impossible." Brian exploded. "You can't do this to us." "I can, and I did. All legal, documented, with psychological evaluation, certifying my mental soundness." "Dad," Ashley began to cry. "Why are you doing this to us? We're your family." "Family?" Frank laughed without humor. "Family cares about each other. Family offers support in difficult times. Family doesn't see the other just as a source of money." "Who did you leave the inheritance to?" Brian asked, his voice laden with anger. "To Michael, my godson. Someone who never asked me for anything, but always offered me genuine affection." Brian exploded in fury. "This is absurd. You're crazy. We'll contest this in court." "Feel free to do so. I have all the documents in order, including medical reports certifying my mental soundness. Ashley continued crying, but Frank realized they were tears of anger and frustration, not genuine sadness over the broken relationship. Dad, reconsider. This, please. We can change. We can be different. Ashley, you had months to be different. You had the opportunity to support me when I needed it most. You chose to see me only as a provider. The argument continued for another hour, with Brian making threats and Ashley alternating between pleas and accusations. But Frank remained firm in his decision. When they finally left, the house was silent again. But this time, it wasn't the heavy silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace, of the decision made, of the man who had recovered his dignity. The days that followed the confrontation with Ashley and Brian brought a mixture of relief and melancholy to Frank. It was as if he had undergone a necessary but painful surgery. The wound was still sensitive, but he knew the infection had been removed. For an entire week, Ashley called every day, sometimes crying, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. Brian sent WhatsApp messages alternating between reconciliation attempts and veiled threats of lawsuits. But Frank remained steadfast. Each manipulation attempt only confirmed he had made the right decision. The following Thursday, the phone rang once more. Frank, tired of his daughter's dramatic appeals, almost didn't answer. But something made him change his mind. Hello? Godfather. It was Michael's voice, but it sounded different, worried. Michael, it's good to hear you. How are you? Godfather, I need to talk to you. Can I come over now? Of course, my son. Did something happen? Better we talk in person. 20 minutes later, Michael was in Frank's living room, looking uncomfortable and nervous. It was the first time Frank had seen him like this. What's going on, Michael? Godfather, Ashley called me yesterday. Michael looked at his own hands as he spoke. She told me about the will. Frank felt his heart quicken. And what did you think? Godfather, I was shocked. Not because I don't feel honored by the trust you've placed in me, but because I don't want my relationship with you to be contaminated by money issues. Michael. Let me finish, please. Michael finally raised his eyes to face him. I've always visited you because I enjoy your company, because you're important. To me, because I've learned a lot from your stories and your teachings. Never, not for a second, did I think about inheritance or money. I know that, my son. That's precisely why I made this decision. But now I'm afraid people will think I influenced you somehow. I'm afraid our sincere relationship will be questioned. Michael stood up and began walking around the room. Ashley has already insinuated that I manipulated you against her. Frank felt a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness, knowing his daughter was capable of such accusations. Pride, confirming he had chosen the right person to trust his legacy. Michael, sit here. Frank patted the sofa beside him. Do you want to know why I chose you? Godfather. No, let me speak now. Frank smiled, a serene expression on his face. You just demonstrated exactly why I made the right choice. Anyone driven by greed would have been happy with the news. You're concerned about our relationship, about the sincerity of our feelings. That tells me everything about your character. Michael sighed. But what if Ashley is right? What if I unconsciously influenced you? My son, have you ever seen me asking for anything? Have you ever insinuated that you needed financial help? Have you ever made any comment about inheritance or the future? Never. And do you know why I changed the will? It wasn't just because of Ashley and Brian's greed. It was because I realized I was being treated like an object, not like a person. You treat me like a person. You listen to me, you're interested. In my stories, you care about my feelings. They talked for hours. Frank told in detail about the months of loneliness after losing Margaret, about how he had felt used and disrespected, about how Michael's sincerity had been like a beacon amid the storm. Godfather, I accept your decision, but with one condition. What's that? I want you to promise me that you'll live many more years, because our relationship has nothing to do with inheritance. I want to have you around for as long as possible." Frank was moved. "I promise, my son. In fact, I have plans for the coming years." "What plans?" "Remember the country house I built with Margaret in the early years of our marriage? Of course, you always spoke of it fondly. I'm thinking of moving there. This house now holds too many sad memories. There I can start over, have a bigger garden, maybe some animals, and you can visit me whenever you want." Michael smiled for the first time since he arrived. "Can I go with you to see the house?" "It would be an honor." The following Saturday, they traveled to the small town where Frank's property was located. The country house had been built 30 years earlier when he and Margaret dreamed of retirement. It was a simple but cozy construction, with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a garden that extended to a small stream. "It's beautiful, Godfather." Michael walked around the property, admiring the landscape. "And this silence, what peace. Margaret and I always said this was our little piece of paradise." Frank sat on the porch, watching his godson explore the grounds. "She didn't get to retire, but we always planned to spend our last years here. And now you're going to realize that dream for both of you." "Exactly." They spent the weekend cleaning the house, planning small renovations, imagining what Frank's life would be like in that refuge. Michael offered to help with the move, to visit regularly, to be the family that Frank deserved to have. On Monday, when they returned to Chicago, Frank had already made another important decision. He called Mr. Morris. "Richard, I'd like to make one more change to the documents." "Of course, Frank. What's it about?" "I want to officially make Michael my son by adoption. I know he's already an adult, but I want him to be legally recognized as my son." The adoption of an adult was a simpler process, especially when there was consent from both parties. Mr. Morris explained the procedures, and in a few weeks everything was arranged. When Frank told Michael the news, the young man was moved to tears. "Godfather, Dad, I don't even know what to call you now." "You can call me whatever you've always called me. What matters is what we feel for each other, not the titles." Meanwhile, Ashley and Brian tried every way to reverse the situation. They sought lawyers, threatened lawsuits, spread to everyone that Frank was being manipulated, but all attempts ran into the impeccable documentation that Mr. Morris had prepared. In one last attempt, Ashley showed up at Frank's house on a Tuesday afternoon. This time she brought the children. Grandpa. Dylan and Emma ran to hug him, and Frank felt his heart tighten. He loved his grandchildren, but he knew they were being used by their mother. "Hi, my loves. How are you?" "We're fine, Grandpa." "Mom said you're angry with her." Frank looked at Ashley over the children's heads. She had taught her children to say this. "I'm not angry, my darlings. Sometimes adults need to make difficult decisions." Ashley let the children play in the garden and approached her father. "Dad, let's try one more time. I know I made mistakes. I know Brian made mistakes too. But we're your family. These are your grandchildren. Ashley, you can be my daughter forever, regardless of the will. What changed was my trust in your sincerity. But Dad, if you give me a chance..." "How many chances did you need, Ashley? I spent 3 months practically abandoned, and you only showed up when you needed money. We can change. Maybe you can. But it won't be because of an inheritance. If you change, it will be because you truly understood the value of family, relationships." When Ashley left with the children, Frank felt a deep melancholy. It wasn't hatred he felt for his daughter, but an immense sadness for the lost opportunity to have a genuine relationship. 2 weeks later, Frank moved to the country house. Michael helped him with the move, and for the first few days, stayed there to ensure everything went well. "You know, Dad," said Michael on the last night before returning to Chicago, "I think you've made the bravest decision I know." "Why?" "Because you chose your own dignity over convenience. You chose truth over illusion. That takes a lot of courage." Frank smiled, watching the stars through the bedroom window. "You know what Margaret always told me?" "What?" "That life is too short to be wasted with people who don't value us. It took me a while to understand what she meant, but now I do." Michael left the next morning, promising to return the following weekend. Frank was left alone in the country, house, but for the first time in months, the solitude didn't weigh on him. It was a chosen solitude, dignified, filled with peace. In the months that followed, Frank created a new routine. He woke up early, tended to the garden, read the books. He had always wanted to read, wrote letters to old friends. Michael visited him religiously every weekend, bringing news from the city, helping with small repairs, simply keeping him company. Ashley called a few times in the first few months, but the calls became rarer. She still hadn't understood that. Frank's change wasn't temporary, it was definitive. On a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the move, Frank was on the porch when he heard the sound of a car approaching. It was Michael, but he wasn't alone. Next to him came a beautiful young woman. "Dad, I want to introduce someone to you. This is Jessica, my girlfriend." Frank stood up to greet the young woman. She seemed genuinely happy to meet him. There was no pretense in her smile. "Michael talks a lot about you," she said. "It's an honor to finally meet you." During lunch, Frank observed the couple with affection. Michael was clearly in love, and Jessica seemed to be a good-hearted person. They talked about marriage, about plans for the future, about how they wanted Frank to be an important part of their lives. "You know, Dad," Michael said when Jessica went to help in the kitchen. "I never had a solid family model at home. My parents separated when I was little. But watching you and Aunt Margaret, I learned what a real marriage is. I want to build that with Jessica." Frank was moved. His legacy would not just be material, but of values, of example, of love. That night after the couple left, Frank sat on the porch to contemplate the stars. He thought of Margaret, certain that she would approve of all the decisions he had made. He thought of Ashley, hoping that one day she would understand that true love can't be bought with money. And he thought of Michael, the son that life had given him as a gift when he needed it most. At 72, Frank had learned that family isn't just blood. It's choice, it's care, it's sincere presence in the moments that matter. And looking at the future that was taking shape before him, he smiled. He had found his true family, and with it the peace he was looking for. Frank's story wasn't about revenge or hurt. It was about dignity, about the courage to make difficult choices, and about the discovery that it's never too late to start over. It was about a man who refused to be treated as an object, and who, in fighting for his own value, found true love in its purest form, that which expects nothing in return except the reciprocity of affection. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that Frank and Michael's story has touched your hearts and made you reflect on the true meaning of family and sincere relationships. To continue this emotional journey with us, we've prepared a special playlist with equally engaging stories that explore the complexity of human feelings. You can find it by clicking here. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring unique narratives that celebrate the strength of the human heart and the capacity to start over that we all have within us. Don't miss our upcoming content, and tell us in the comments which part of the story